looking forward to our conversation today about auditing invoices. And why are we auditing invoices? To avoid wasted spending. So thanks for making the time.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let me put a little context around the conversation. You say that auditing invoices for discrepancies, possible duplicate payments, is something that not every payables department does systematically, does well. And the result of that is potentially tens of millions of dollars paid unnecessarily for invoices that do have duplications, errors, mistakes. My question to you is, auditing invoices seems like basic hygiene in a payables department. And why is that so complicated, so hard, and therefore putting payables department at such risk?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing is that companies have grown tremendously over the years. Revenue continues to accelerate, growth continues to accelerate, which means usually more vendors, more partners. You're paying for more services. You're charging other customers for more services. You're bringing on subcontractors. Then you have to charge for those services as well as a pass through. What happens is, even though it seems like basic hygiene, if you're dealing in units of 10 to 15 to 20 invoices on a monthly basis, it's something that a single person can do. But as companies have scaled, especially large MNCs, they've run into a problem where they have many thousands of invoices. Mm-hmm. And so to check every single line item and every single, tax line item on an invoice, every single currency fluctuation on an invoice in an increasingly real-time world, it is incredibly costly. It requires a lot of human touch. And so what actually happens is they just sort of spot check. Mm-hmm. They look at a series of invoices, maybe from a particular vendor, a supplier that you might have overseas, perhaps, and you kind of spot check based on how you feel that vendor may be overcharging you or undercharging you. And you kind of visually look at duplicates. It's literally humans. The best practice is humans with the standard operating procedure of kind of spot checking things and then realizing they made a mistake later and then asking that vendor for their money back. That's actually the standard operating procedure today. A lot of systems have been put in place, obviously, to mitigate some of that risk, right, but it's still mostly a human scale operation.
Well, that was my question. There's been an awful lot of automation, automated payables, investments in automated payables, yet still the best practice is human intervention.
Yeah, I usually think that there's something like $215 billion in Fintech capital deployed last year, $1.7-ish billion spent on just invoice automation in the US alone. And it's all still pretty 1990s. So what ends up happening is an AP team, you've got invoices coming in, you may or may not have access to the contract or the purchase order. And so you manually go find on a share drive somewhere in an email inbox the thing that initiated this payment. Mm-hmm. And then you try to match those as best you can. There's a lot of search and discovery problem in that. And so what we've seen mostly in this industry to date is companies will take on the burden of extracting data from invoices on your behalf, as an example, or large BPOs will take those invoices and kind of match them to whatever data they have. They might do this for a fixed fee or may do it on contingency, but it's still humans matching these things. Sort of the bleeding edge out of the ERP systems was new tables. So it required humans to enter data into new tables and then to build rules around those. And so it just isn't really a human scale problem, but we're doing, as an industry, we keep applying workflow to humans instead of just solving the real problem, which is that process needs to be automated for 100% of your invoices, not a 5% spot checking.
Is this problem more acute in particular industries or size of company? Where do you find the issue to be most egregious?
Yeah, so I think it's funny. I talk to other startups that I invest in or I know founders of, and they've overpaid on AWS bills. So it certainly affects everyone, no matter how big you are. However, the more invoices you have, naturally, the more difficult and challenging it is, the more brittle your invoice processing probably is, and probably the bigger your team is to handle it. But even 50 people trying to process thousands of invoices a month is probably not going to yield the results you're looking for. So we do find that companies that are 2 billion, 3 billion plus in terms of annual turnover, usually have enough invoices to generate an extreme ROI in a short period of time. But that said, it does affect everyone from the little startup with Amazon bills clear up to the large manufacturer. The other component of that, though, is variability in invoices is a really big challenge. If you're just paying, you know, you and I, we pay our Netflix bill. We know how much Netflix is going to cost every month, roughly. They're not going to overcharge us because it's like a subscription based on a credit card. Most enterprise billing is not like that. And so you really have to look at the variability in the contracts. So like fuel surcharges in manufacturing and logistics companies, as an example, media surcharges, creative line items, those types of things in media companies. So you run into this in both, you know, terrestrial media, streaming, you know, online. You kind of run into it across the board because of the variability in their contracts. And so we like to focus on variable cost invoices because it's usually the biggest bang for a buck in terms of ROI for our customers.
Do you have a sense of the size of the problem and therefore the return on investment? You mentioned ROI, the return on the investment of investing to solve it?
Yeah, so I think it's somewhat funny when you talk to customers, they know it's a big challenge. They don't really think of it beyond a headcount problem, right? Because they know that they're destroying gross margins by scaling headcount linearly. But the thing that's really fascinating is we ran a study in May of this year, and we actually took about $500 million worth of varied spend through our platform and found $42 million.
Really?
Roughly 500 million. We do about, I think we're right around 15 billion in spend throughput right now as a company, but we took a $500 million subset of that and across a wide variety. So like transportation, manufacturing, things like that, and found 42 million in duplicate invoices just within that 500 million. And so we're looking at around, 8-ish% duplicate billing rates. And that's just duplicate billings. That's nothing like line item level, over billings, taxes, things of that nature. That's purely duplications that we're able to find. And, these are not small suppliers that are trying to fraudulently bill our customers. These are large companies who have a lot of subcontractors. They're trying to do the right thing and they're just overbilling the customer, and the customer's not able to catch it because it looks like any other invoice they've received.
Do they catch it ever? They must catch it at some point and realize the mistake they've made.
Yeah, so I think there's two ways about it. One, we have a customer who's publicly said that we found a $518,000 overbilling on a single invoice last year for them. Wow. And it's not uncommon, but we found this one in particular. And she said that they never would have found it without us. Just never would have happened because they can't afford to check every invoice. They're too big. And so I think what we find is that customers wouldn't have found that. However, if you do find something because you do a retroactive audit process, as an example, so you go through your standard reconciliation before you pay, then you pay because you got to get it done because you don't want to be a consistent late payer, so you don't want to hit credit checks, et cetera. So you process the payment. And then your standard operating procedure is to beg your vendor for the money back, which means destruction of cash flow, destruction of cost of capital. It takes 6 months to do. You might have to hire an outside auditor. So you've got scaling costs that scale, beyond linearly. And so no, typically they don't find it. We found every single customer we've worked with during the POC process, we found millions of dollars in ROI within like a week of working on proof of concept.
I mean, that's significant. I mean, anytime, but especially now as businesses are really looking to optimize cash. It just seems like this is low-hanging fruit to actually find cash by just being more intelligent about the invoices that are being submitted and approved to pay.
Yeah, I think you cannot be a successful business any longer by being forced to call a vendor and ask them to change the format of their invoice. Right. That's what we sort of got with legacy systems like OCR tools and things like that, is you call up your vendor and you say, please, put the supplier name over here, put the invoice number here. That's just not a scalable way to run a business. And so we've focused instead on working with customers to very quickly what they call beat inflation. So historically, every CFO calls the supply chain person and says, beat inflation this year, which used to be 3%. right? And it was hard, 3%.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine how hard it is at 8%. So we walk in, we have a solution that they can in fact beat inflation in a very short period of time and generate, 10, 20, 38x ROI last quarter for one of our customers.
That's amazing. I want to understand that more, but I want to first ask how much of the discrepancy is just also legitimate. Things are more expensive because the cost of goods are more expensive and they're passing that along versus some of the things that represent, overbilling or duplicate billing. Is there a rough rule of thumb there?
That's a great question. So duplicate billing is roughly 8.5% of the time. And that's not intentional. It's just because of how they format things. Then you have overbilling, and overbilling is usually because a regional sales office filled out a purchase order at an amount that they weren't aware of in the contract. So the contract stipulates some accessorial charge or forgives an accessorial charge that the regional sales office isn't familiar with. So it's just a lack of their internally within the vendor understanding what the contract actually says. We see a lot of that. That's probably 30-ish% of all invoices fail because of that sort of line item level difference. Then you think about cost increases. For our customers, most of their costs are contracted. So you're not going to see a discrepancy with a system like ours in terms of contracted delta. However, if the price just naturally rises over time, such as fuel surcharges, that sort of discrepancy pops up, but it's usually an AP team has to manage that within a percentage fluctuation they're allowed. So our system automatically figures that out and makes sure that we don't, raise it as a discrepancy, as an example, unless it's over that percentage. I think the bigger challenge right now is that the lack of globalization rather in Europe has created currency fluctuations that are somewhat rare and new. And so we start to see a lot of currency fluctuations on invoices that are surprising to our customer and perhaps already have been contracted out. And so it's important to raise those as a component of this sort of modern supply chain that we're dealing with.
So you've talked about the best practices today, which don't seem like very good best practices. They seem like worst practices to me. So what is the new best practice that you've been able to provide clients to save them, not only money, but the headcount cost associated with trying to keep up with this problem?
I think the first thing is a change in mindset. It's now going from a cost center as revenue processors, as the AP team, to effectively a profit center as the AP team. So instead of paying them to do something they weren't hired to do, which is to draw boxes around supplier names and invoices, as an example, as a somewhat a criminal example in our space. Instead of paying them to do that, in fact, you're focusing them on clawing back dollars or preventing payment and initiating supplier negotiations, giving them the visibility that they need to figure out which suppliers are the ones they need to speak with procurement about. So giving them detailed insights into their spend. But it is a real shift in mindset. You go from, let's say, an understaffed team of 20 AP people processing, let's say, 15,000, 20,000 invoices a month, as an example, to processing 100% of their invoices with far less manpower per invoice, certainly. And then that way they can be focused on the dispute resolution and preventing and blocking the payment, which is actually what they were hired for in the first place.
Right.
Of course, but now making sure that they have the workflow and tools that they need to communicate with the rest of the organization. And that's a massive shift, right? To go from standard operating procedure of clawing back capital after a reconciliation to standard operating procedure of preventing it in the first place, preventing the overspend in the first place.
What process and workflow and staffing changes need to align with this new best practice? Are there changes? A change in mindset is one thing. What about the change in the composition of the team and what internally companies need to do in order to take maximum advantage of what you offer?
We had a theory about it originally and we were wrong. So the theory originally was that you would need fewer people to do the work of AP because the system's doing so much heavy lifting. And while that's true from a reconciliation standpoint, what you actually find is that you have a team of much more pleasant workers, happier to be there. In fact, I think at one of our webinars, at the last part of the webinar, our customer said, before OpenEnvoy, I didn't like my job. And afterwards, I'm happy to work here. And she's a controller of about, $3 billion worth of spend. So that actually matters to us.
It matters. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think so. Number one is reducing the amount of turnover that these organizations have found in the past 2 years, especially because there's been a lot of staffing shortage, especially in the finance department. So that's number one, happier employees. Number two is, from a workflow perspective, the operations and sales, the frontline teams, have to be less involved because they don't have to approve or click next on, which is what really happens in most systems. They don't have to approve every single invoice that comes in. That's automatically matched. And now they're only focused on discrepancies. So you end up with a healthier supplier relationship, even at the foremost, the front lines of your organization. So I think the changes that occur are, you can have much happier people on your team. Number one. Number two is they're focused on value add work versus valueless sort of copy, paste, re-entering, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, where there's also a lot of room for mistakes, even though the system or the process is designed to avoid them. I mean, that kind of repetition and monotony, people just don't see things because they're going through the motions.
That's right. And when you outsource it to a team such as a BPO, as an example, typically you outsource that overseas, you offshore that work because you think, well, it's cost less, right? So that's why you do it. The truth is they're just humans using the exact same process that you had. They're not going to change the process when there's a problem, and they're going to make the same mistakes you make, but they're going to make them at 2 a.m. Right? So they can't.
I don't know, does that make it worse or better? It's still a mistake.
Yeah, that's a good point. I used to think, I see a lot of organizations where they say, it's great, we outsourced everything over there. It's like, okay, so how accurate are they? Like, well, 80, doesn't matter. It's 80%, but they're so expensive.
And it's not in my time zone, so I don't.
It's not in my time zone. The problem is it's not in your time zone, so you can't fix it either quickly.
Exactly.
Right? So it ends up unresolved.
So what's the magic? What's the secret sauce that is the technology that underpins this new process that makes all of the things we've been talking about real and tangible for a business?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of technology and model, quite honestly. So if you look at the space, and I have for many years as I've been buying AP automation software for my own companies in the past, you look at companies who provide people as a service, which we've just talked about, that benefits, pros and cons of that. The second component is you have ERP systems that sort of are, 18 months to implement, no one's happy at the end of them sort of situations. And then you finally have sort of contingency firms. What we looked at and we said, the technology needs to be modern technology. So we're not, we're not backed by slow growth capital who refuses to spend on R&D, which is what most of the industry now is. If you look at the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of that invoice processing, intelligent document management systems were born in that time zone, in that time frame. So we've been able to come in with modern technology, modern expectations. This is 2022. You should not have to be drawing boxes around invoices in order to get an OCR tool to work. That's just not necessary anymore. Those days are well gone and well behind us. But that's what most people are still doing in their AP departments.
Matt, thanks so much for your time and for giving us an inside look at OpenEnvoy.
Thanks for having me.